I think certainly some patients had that experience for
Okay,
sure.
so if you had that experience, are you more likely to have that experience if you're not progressing your Alzheimer's disease, or do you think you're more likely to have that experience if your Alzheimer's disease is rapidly moving along and you're not so sturdy anymore?
Yeah, I think we're in the latter camp there. I think it's
so, so it's likely that in fact you're not actually measuring the effect of this drug. What you're really measuring is are Alzheimer's patients whose disease is progressing more slowly better off than Alzheimer's patients whose disease is progressing more rapidly? And I think we know that the answer to that, of course, the patients who can withstand, it's no different than if you said, well, what is the cognition of Alzheimer's patients who could withstand a push to the ground? It'd be a very mean thing to do to an older person. But if you said, well, if you did that, out of some weird morose curiosity, if you had 200 patients on placebo, or 200 patients who didn't get pushed, and 200 patients who did, you would have, and you start to throw out the patients who didn't tolerate the push, you would actually be selecting for really sturdy patients that would have good cognition and would outperform a randomly selected group. That's sort of the reasoning as to why, if you look at this data and you starting, if you're there and you're long and you're thinking, well, I see that the drug works. I see that the drug is getting better, the drug group, versus the placebo group. How could that be possible without the drug working? I think that's why the stock has any market cap and not a 5 million market cap, is because if you look at the two lines, you say, well, it looks like the drug's getting better. I'm not stupid. I could see the lines are better than the placebo. But if you throw out the bad guys, the people who are doing really poorly, of course they're going to be better. And I think that's the trick that has been played on us. And you can go through this whole, you know, ordeal about how do we treat missing data in clinical trials. There's a wide array of ways to do it, and we can go through some of those details for those who are more informed about how clinical trials work. In my day, I used to do LOCF and BOCF, which is best observation carried forward and worst observation carried forward, at least. And we've mostly changed over the last 20 years to MMRM, which is a mixed repeated measures model. And that model is mostly the way we do analysis now, but there's still other ways of handling data that are important. And I want you to touch on that a little bit. It's pretty advanced statistics, so I want you to keep it as simple as you can, to the
sure.
extent you can.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, in essence, what you can do is just see what happens if things were a little different and then test your assumptions. So in this case, what you can do is take all of the patients who were removed from the trial and the drug arm, and assume that they do X better. Like on average, did they do 1 point better than what happened? Did they do on average 2 points better than what actually happened? What is reported? And so on. So you can create what's known as like a tipping scale analysis, tipping point analysis, and just think of a scale. Like just think of a scale where it's like, okay, we're in balance right now, but if we tip the scale like even a little bit, like we put a little bit of weight on this one side, now we're out of balance. And what does that mean? Well, if it's out of balance, it's not stat sig anymore, and the result is essentially spurious, and we
So
don't really have much to talk
if
about.
the missing patients were truly missing at random, in other words, it didn't make a difference, their cognition was, the same, whether you dropped out of placebo or you dropped out of drug, then we'd have nothing to talk about here, and they might have a signal. But it sounds like from the math and the disclosures they made, which Capricorn did this too, they kind of tucked this away in the appendix. That's exactly what Anavex did here. Basically, the tipping point analysis says the people who did drop out of the drug group were worse than the people that dropped out of the placebo. Because if you changed those assumptions, you would have lost the statistical significance. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I mean, if these missing patients did even a little bit better than how the rest of the cohort did, like this whole trial is no longer stat sig. And luckily for us as well, like the EMA is pretty clear. Like the EMA offers guidance, like they write documents, they put it all in writing about how they think about this kind of stuff. And specifically for how Anavex set up this analysis, it just is, it's just not congruent with like how the EMA thinks about it. And what do I mean? So like um there are like you said, there are different ways that we can account for these missing patients, and the way that Anavex did it relies on the assumption that like like the missing patients have like nothing to do with the drug. They have nothing to do with like the effects or the outcomes. It's just like, oh, they randomly went missing from the trial. Like they moved cities and like no longer. This is the example I use. They like a patient like moves cities and can no longer go to their treatment center. So therefore they got dropped off the trial. Like that would be missing at random. That would be like a legitimately random thing to have happen on a clinical trial. What isn't random is like all of your patients taking the drug and then suddenly dropping off because they got ill on the drug. Like that's not random. Like that's specifically because of like the drug or like the patient's baseline characteristics, like we've already kind of touched on. And so because of that, you have to create a really robust way of handling missing data, which they have a lot of, and the thing about it is like when you do this kind of work too, like the more missing data, like the harder it is to prove that that data has nothing to do with the the final
And
result.
this is why we do big clinical trials, so we get unambiguous p-values and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And in this case, the results are quite ambiguous. Yeah.
It's also why we
The
do several trials oftentimes. So I think the company on Tuesday met with the EMA. They did what's called an oral, or the CHMP, and they met and did what was called an oral explanations. They get 20 minutes to give a presentation, and they get grilled for 40 minutes. And we think, so the meeting ends today, and we'll see meeting minutes tomorrow. So I think, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, that we see the stock go to $1 tomorrow. Why? I think the CHMP will render its opinion in the meeting minutes. Those will be available on the EMA's website. And, and they'll explain that they don't believe this drug works and the new clinical trial is warranted. Remember, the EMA is a lot stricter than the FDA. One of the biggest red
very strict.
flags, one of the biggest red flags for me on this company is that they never filed for FDA approval. We know the FDA is a lot more lenient. They approved Aduhelm. They approved a lot of other drugs that, including, say, Sarepta's drugs that some people feel don't work, while EMA refused to approve all those drugs. So they're very, very strict. And it is very curious why you wouldn't file in America, which is more lenient. You're an American company, and it's a much bigger market. Europe is notoriously broke and doesn't like to pay for new drugs, and it's just one of these things that has never been explained, and I think is really one of the biggest red flags I've ever seen in my career when a company is maybe not legally allowed to proceed in one country, which again begs the question. The US was willing to look at non US data, for example, especially for a huge unmet medical need. So, really, really bizarre thing there. But getting back to the timing, I think it's quite likely that we see it tomorrow. If we don't, I think the next date is December 10th. Is that right? Or maybe
I
the
think the 12th.
12th? Yeah, the 12th
We'll
will
be
be
the 12th.
the minutes. So EMA or comp publishes these minutes, and the minutes sometimes contain the opinion of that week, but sometimes they need an extra month to write up that opinion. I think they'll write it up for tomorrow, and this stock will be down 80% tomorrow. I'm going out on a limb and saying that, but if that doesn't happen, I think it's closer to 75-25. But I acknowledge that there is a 25% chance that we see this on December 12th. Either way, it's toast. There isn't a person in the right mind if they, especially a group of people that have ever looked at clinical trials for more than even a year or two, which the CHMP is a very, very strict and very well, they're a very, very strong group. There's no fools in that group. Unlike perhaps sometimes the FDA, which is very lenient and knowingly lenient about interpreting clinical data, there's no interpretation here. And I think that we see that rejection either tomorrow or in, say, 3 or 4 weeks in the next meeting. I think Anthony has maybe a slightly different perspective here, but I think we're both aligned that there is no way this drug gets approved by the EMA, which is the only place they've filed for approval for, and the only reason it's not a penny stock. Maybe you want to give your thoughts on this, Anthony.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that it is more likely tomorrow than next month, although I just think that it could certainly happen next month. I think that me and me and our team have looked at some of the historical precedents for this, it's helpful to some extent, right? Like looking at history is helpful to see the future, and so we do that. We look at like the past year or two's worth of EMA decisions and reviews, and we see that sometimes these decisions can be pushed out a little bit further for rendering their opinion. Even if they ultimately rule that it's like a negative opinion, which is what we're kind of thinking will happen here. We think that the FDA, the EMA will put out a negative opinion. They'll let Anavex know, like, right about now, actually, yeah, in the evening of on Thursday, that they're trending in this direction. And then look, Anavex can decide if they want to pull out and withdraw their application, or if they want to feel the full force of the EMA. Today or tomorrow, next month, or sorry, yeah, today or tomorrow. But ultimately, I think that we do see a negative opinion, either like you said, tomorrow or next month. We've been over it. I mean, like at the end of the day, this analysis
Yeah.
is highly flawed, highly spurious, and even when we compare this to other Alzheimer's drugs, I mean, we just like Leqembi was initially lecanemab was initially rejected by the EMA, so was donanemab. But and they had like way higher thresholds for this kind of tipping
Right.
point analysis we mentioned earlier. Like they went as far as to show that like their analysis held with even a 5 point delta.
Well, you
So
also had separation immediately, right? And that, and
it's a
you,
real drug. It
and
was a
you,
real
and
drug.
you have separation right away. You have a mechanism of action that makes sense. It wasn't invented by one guy from Europe and pen and paper 40 years ago. This was, these are real drugs engineered by real teams of real professionals. And I think that, the EMA sees through quite a lot of this. And, as probably the strictest approval, kind of committee in the world, I think it's a slam dunk. Not to tip our own hat here or like pat our own back, but like I can pat your back, I guess. The last trade we did together was ATYR. That stock went down what 80%.
Yeah.
The trade before that was Immune. That stock went around down 80% as well, I think. And that was an Alzheimer's drug as well, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and then we did. I don't know how much we worked on this together, but I did Galectin, which went down 50-ish%, and then Cassava, which went down 90%. So that was four in a row, at least for me. I think you've had a couple of wins yourself that were independent of me, and this should be five in a row, at least for me, with public, sort of public proclamations of failure. Um, you know, what we, I think, and again, I'll see how much I'm speaking for you or if you disagree, but for me, you can go anywhere and find a biotech catalyst list. And there are literally dozens of phase 3 outcomes or FDA outcomes per month that you can bet on, and you can bet on at random, and you can decide, okay, this works, this doesn't work. We don't do that. We try to find the most obvious, no chance in hell situation and bet aggressively on that. That's kind of been the hallmark of my career. If you go back and see some of my stuff on Seeking Alpha or some short reports I did 20 years ago, I think I inspired a lot of people in the short report sort of community. I never used third parties to fund my shorts. I always just did it for myself. And we don't have any third party funding here. But I think that, that sort of world was born of, in large parts, trying to short a stock, get a reaction from the market, and get out. And we don't do that. We've never done that. What we do is we make the call and we stick to it till the end of the call. So I won't be covering any short today. I won't be. I'm just shorting more because I'm convinced that I'm right, and that's the style that we take to this. We care about being right. We care about helping people, quite frankly, who buy biotech stocks at random. We implore these communities to think twice about what they're doing, but unfortunately, you really can't convince people of anything in arguments. Once people buy, they sort of reinforce their belief. We saw this with entire Reddit groups, entire Discord groups dedicated to the stocks, where we plainly and carefully tried to demonstrate it. In fact, there's one guy on Twitter, Matt Nachtrab, who bet $70 million on Cassava. 7-0, no joke. He sold his company, successful tech entrepreneur, bet $70 million on SAVA. It's my pinned tweet. The drug did not work by any stretch of the imagination. And the stock went down 80, 90%. And you still couldn't talk sense into anyone. At some point, in fact, people usually ostrich, put their head in the ground and say, no, I'm not going to listen to you. I don't want to hear that. I want to gamble. is typically what they're doing. So for us, I think I can speak for myself by saying that like a lot of people say, what's your ulterior motive here? You just want me to sell my shares. No, I don't care if you sell your shares or not. I'm going to win and make money anyway. I feel bad for people that don't have the scientific background, which, by the way, isn't extensive. I'm not a physician or a PhD. I don't think Anthony is either. We've just spent a lot of time in industry. We've seen a lot of this. And it's pretty clear to anybody who's been in industry, which is why Anavex doesn't have too many institutional holders. A lot of the companies I mentioned earlier also didn't have institutional holders. And if you can't find a biotech hedge fund or mutual fund or something like that that's long the stock and it's all individuals, that's a pretty good sign that you're up Schitt's Creek. And that is the case here with Anavex as well. So I don't know if you sympathize with any of that, Anthony, or you have anything to add or subtract to it?
Yeah, I mean, this company's cooked, brother. Like, like you can't just, rely on spurious clinical trial results. And I have no problem saying it out loud. Like, at the end of the day, a company needs to come out with good data and be honest and have integrity. And I bet on those companies all day long. I bet I have my longs. I love
Well,
longs as well,
what would you say
but
to your motivations? If somebody says, "Well, I'm long 50,000 shares of this stock. I bought it because God knows what reason. I read it on a Reddit or YouTube. Why are you telling me to sell? I mean, you just want me to capitulate, don't you?"
I look. I personally, I think that this. I'm not just like a better of biotechs. I'm a practitioner of biotechs. I've been in biotechs for a very long time myself. I've been in since I got out of school, but well before I was in school, I always wanted to be in biotech, and I want this industry to grow, and I want it to do well, and I want it to make impactful new medicines. Like, that's what it's all about. Like, I have had this dream in my head personally of impactful medicines, benefiting people's lives that I've had a hand in help creating for many years, since I was a kid, and that's ultimately the world that I want to live in. And when people like the types that come up with these really really implausible drugs and implausible medical devices and what have you. Like, whenever these things come up, it just leaves a black mark on the industry. It just leaves investors with a bitter taste in their mouth, and they all walk away. And it's very difficult to have a sustained growth in this industry when you have that kind of a backdrop, when you have this risk profile associated with it, when you have bad
Right,
actors
right, right.
acting in this way. And so for me, my interests are really aligned with just, making sure that everyone who listens to me knows where I'm at, but like
Right.
also that I try to have my 2 cents in helping people kind of, get to have a good time in biotech, basically. Like, that's what it's
I
about. Cause I
see.
think that
Yeah.
investment begets more investment. Insofar as it's like actually useful, and has a good effect for patients and people and stakeholders. So
That's really interesting. I'm totally the kind of, I wouldn't say opposite, but totally different. I don't care if biotech has a good reputation or not. I think that's a lofty goal and a very good goal. And I didn't even think of that, which shows you kind of where my mind's at. I mean, it's not a bad thing, but it's not something I'd go out of my way for. I care about the guy who's got $6,000 and is putting $3,000 on ATYR because he thinks it's going to go to $300,000 and he can retire. And I probably sympathize with that guy because I was that guy when I was 17 or 18. And I spent a career in this trying to figure out my ass from my elbow. And now I know my ass from my elbow. And it doesn't take much to tell people. And one of the nice things about it is it doesn't cost me anything because, again, I'm short. I shorted before this, obviously. I'm shorting through it. It would be like very unethical to like start covering my position, I think. A lot of people do that in the short community. It's not what I like to do because it just kind of looks bad and it feels bad and it's just gross. And I feel like you are incentivized then to scare the world into your belief system. I'm not trying to scare anybody. I'm trying to show you, what I feel. And if I was going to cover, then I certainly think that that would make sense. But I've shown with pretty great transparency that I don't cover throughout these. Sometimes I short more throughout these. And, I'm confident and I'm rarely wrong. And I think that it's fun to be right. It's fun to flex your muscles and say, I know what I'm talking about. But, I'd say that for the little guy, it's it's like, don't, I always try to tell people when they say, Martin, how do I turn $1,000 into $1,000,000 or something like that? And I said, you're going, the market is a competitive place. You're going up against me, Ken Griffin, smarter people than me, quants, et cetera. it's very easy to trade the market thanks to Robinhood and E-Trade and whatever, but you're still in a hard fight. So sometimes it's very hard to get into a fight that's also very hard. Like the UFC is very hard to climb up the ranks of. You can't just go to Madison Square Garden this weekend and join a UFC fight and say I'm on the I'm on the bill, I'm the headliner. That doesn't work. You got to spend years and years pouring in work before anybody even cares. But imagine if you could do that. That's what the stock market's like. You can just start a UFC fight with Brock Lesnar or Silva or any, McGregor, whatever, one of those dudes tonight. How would you like to do that? Some people would say, "What, are you crazy? I can't fight those guys. I couldn't fight a teddy bear." That's what I would say. And the reality is people do that every day in the stock market anyway. They say, "I want to fight the best fighter in the world. I want to play basketball against Michael Jordan." Now, I would love to play basketball against Michael Jordan, but I wouldn't do it for $1 million. I wouldn't do it for any amount of money because I know I'd lose. But I love playing biotech against people because I know that I'm going to win. And there are situations that scream out, I'm going to win, like this one, where I like to sit down to the table and play. So I feel like, it feels a little bit uh, weird if I sit down to the table and play and don't at least try to say to somebody who's playing poker against me that, "Oh, you have a 2 and a 7 and I have 2 aces. You probably shouldn't go all in." And the person's like, "No, no, I'm going to win. I'm going to win. Don't even talk to me. You know I'm going to win. I know poker. You don't know poker." And I'm sitting there with 2 aces and an ace pops out. And I said, "I think you should fold, man. I really do have 2 aces. You have a 2 and a 7. You showed me your cards. You're not going to win this hand." And the guy says, "You're bluffing. I'm all in." And I said, "All right, I'm going to call this, but I hope you learn your lesson." And usually what happens from what Anthony and I see is these people never invest in biotech again. They get burned and they say it's a fixed market and they blame God knows what, anything but themselves, and they never touch the industry again. And I think that's one of the reasons biotech is sort of known for its risk because of your point. I never thought about it that way, and I think I'm going to chew on that a little bit because it's kind of interesting. Do you have anything else to say, or should we take some questions? Or
Yeah, no, I'm in agreement with you, man. That's pretty much it for me. If we have more questions, bring them on.
yeah, I would say just let's keep the questions to the Anavex thing. I don't want to talk about quantum computing or any other stocks or whatever. Anthony and I are busy. We got a lot of stuff to do, and we're here to talk about Anavex. So if you don't have a question on Anavex, just please don't make your request. Anyway, what's up, Wasim?
Hey man, thanks for having us. Thanks for doing this. I'm not a PhD either, but I have a question. I was just doing some research during the call as I'm new to the ticker. It was on my watch list, but I never got to it. So, how much did the company's prior if trial failure, like for example in Rett syndrome, which they called the excellent study, influence this decision? Because when Anavex announced the trial missed its primary endpoints, they immediately blamed like high placebo response, which we saw, I think, in cassava, and then immediately, try to pivot to ad hoc analysis. Did you see that as like a playbook that they would use for Alzheimer's as well?
Yeah, I'm joking. I think Anthony and I are both racing to answer this. Yeah, so, so whenever a company says that there is an unexpected placebo effect, that that is basically a synonym for our drug didn't work. Because if you thought the placebo was going to do X and it did better than X, well, you still think you still would have had your drug do better than placebo, right? It's one of the biggest euphemisms that I can think of. It's the silliest thing in the world. It's like saying I didn't run my marathon, less than 4 minutes because my running speed was less than expected. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. I'd say that like if you look at enough biotech shorts, you kind of see a lot of the same themes over and over again. So there's nothing like
Yeah,
too fancy or like
that
different
is definitely the
about
theme.
Anavex.
Placebo did
Again.
better than we thought, and if you throw out these patients, if you throw out every mile but mile 15, I did really great in mile 15. I put in a world record performance in mile 15. You should give me the medal. You should give me the #1 place for the marathon. That's kind of the craziness. And when you dare say, okay, let's just do just mile 15 with you against Usain Bolt, and you say, I don't want to do that. It's kind of this really hard to understand. Statistics are one of these things that the human brain is just terrible at. If you ask any sort of general question about statistics, it's very hard to intuit it. And I think this is the thing that traps almost everyone we see from the retail world, and even the non-retail world, especially non-biotech funds. They'll sometimes make some money and they'll just take a lark on like an immune. We saw somebody do that. We saw that with cassava, and they're just
Yeah.
like, I don't want to study statistics. I don't want, and we saw people just like misunderstand what even a p-value is. And it really doesn't take more than like, I don't know, 3 hours of studying before you pretty much can get a good handle on what like a type 1 error is, or type 2 error is, and error, and other, the null hypothesis, even more advanced concepts. So like just spend an hour or two on that. And I think that, again, how much people want to run away from confirmation or disconfirmation. It's one of the scariest things in human psychology is like, I really don't want to be proven wrong. I will go to the grave before somebody proves me wrong. And the best traders, I mean, really, one of the things Kramer taught me when I was 16, watching him trade, was, the most important skill is changing your mind upon new information. And it's something that humans have the hardest time on. I mean, they just won't change their mind. And it's, if you look at it in Trump and politics in general, forget Trump, when you hear a bad thing about a politician or a good thing about a politician, rarely does it change your mind. You'll take the good thing. But if something bad happens about your politician that is palpably bad, you just dig in and you say, it's all lies, it's a conspiracy. And sometimes it is, I'm sure, but that sort of approach is kind of what happens in biotech, where if you show somebody some data or some statistics, they just really cower in fear because they assume the worst. They assume that you're after their money. They assume that there's this really nefarious thing that you're doing, and in reality, it's just like, hey, like I said, I mean, I know poker, and you don't know poker. You're sitting down at a big poker table with a bunch of poker pros. They all have eating grins on their face, and I have the courtesy to tell you, hey man, you're at the wrong table and you don't know poker, and 2 and 7 is not a good hand in poker. And you have the audacity to say, no, you're wrong. And meanwhile, every other poker pro, that all the healthcare hedge funds, for example, every other poker pro doesn't dare say a word, because why would they? Why would they tip you off? If you want to throw all away your money at the 5,100 no limit table, they're going to let you. And I'm going to let you too, but I'm at least going to sort of be like, hey man, are you sure you're in the right place? And if you've ever been in Vegas and you've had this experience, as you can tell I've had, the nicer poker guys tell you, hey, maybe you want to sit at a lower stakes table. I don't know. It seems like you're going to throw away all your money, or they'll at least sort of give you some body language that maybe you're in the wrong place. And I think that's a nice thing to do. We don't always do it, but I think for the most obvious ones, it's pretty, I don't know, that's my perspective. Like I said, Anthony has a unique and interesting viewpoint on that. But yeah, it's not uncommon tells you that they're probably going to do it here, but there's also the reason we're short now instead of last year when all this happened, or 2 years ago, or this study is so old, which is another red flag, is because like this is it. This is the end of the road. Biotechs have a really weird ability to make sure that they get paid, there's severances attached. Like I'm sure if Chris leaves Anavex, his severance is like 2 or 3 million cash. Does that sound fair to you for presiding over this disgusting drug development thing? $800K a year in salary, stock, bonuses, perks, you name it, and all for a big failure. It's really not fair from my perspective, but regardless, the incentive structure is there, and we're now at the end. This is the final card. This is the river. We will know tomorrow, or at latest the 12th of December, whether or not he won the hand. And it is so obvious to anybody breathing that he didn't win the hand, but if he tries to lie and sneak around it, I wouldn't be that surprised, but I don't think it's going to work. People have seen the writing on the walls. Is that it, Wasim, or can we go to somebody else?
Yeah, that was perfect. Just to follow up on the compensation structure, I think it would be really nice to see biotech's compensation structure be similar to what Elon is doing at Tesla, right? Unless your drug works, you don't get paid. I mean, it's probably never going to happen, but yeah, just throwing
Yeah,
some
I have
ideas
that
there.
with my drug company Retrofin, which is still public. It's called Travere now. And I had a 200K salary, and I debated with my shareholders of going to zero salary just to show my alignment. I had 20% of the shares outstanding, but I got replaced by basically people that, did the Christopher Missling thing. Let me get as much stock as possible. Let me take the least amount of risk possible. Let me get the most amount of cash possible. Forget stock. Cash was the king. And, just coast. And that's the biotech playbook, because one of the scariest things I've learned in my career is many people are very happy with $5 million, and they don't see the difference between 5 and 500. They even don't believe that they can get to 50 or 500, and they will do anything to grab the five and put it in their pocket and make sure it's in their pocket and secure it. And who cares about everybody else? Who cares about the shareholders? Who cares about my colleagues? Who cares about the patients? Let me just secure my 5 million because I've never thought I'd have 5 million, and that's that. But the people like Elon, dare I say myself, Anthony, other people who are confident that they have great skills, they're confident they can create value, they don't want cash because they know cash is easy to get. What's hard to get is stock in a company that's worth billions. That's hard to get. And if you can get that, you can make a fortune. And if you have skills, you believe you can do that. And I think cash comp is one of the biggest alpha signs there is. In fact, Robinhood recently put out a compensation structure for Vlad, who's I think one of the best CEOs. That if he achieved certain outcomes, he'd get really high outcomes. He'd get really high amount of stock. And look, that's the kind of thing that's going to drive somebody. Whereas the average farm executive has no interest in doing any of that. It's a very cushy job. So anyway, we have another question, maybe or two, Henrique. Henrique.
Hello, can you guys hear
Yep.
me? Hi, Martin. Hi, Anthony. Thank you very much for taking the time, and thank you. I've been following you for quite a while, and also followed you on the ATYR short. So thank you very much for that. I'm quite honest. I've not looked at this data from Anavex. I'm just looking at it now, and I just wanted to get really quick. I'm sure you guys already look at the data, but so on the scores that measure the outcome of the drug, uh, when I compare the drug against the placebo, I don't see any difference. At least I'm looking at the Journal of Prevention of Alzheimer's, where they published the data from the study.
Yeah.
It looks like on the CDR-SB score, placebo had a mean change of 1.7 points, whilst the 50 milligram dose has a 1.2. I mean, what is the difference here? Like, I don't see any use of the drug. Is this how can they go forward with this such a insignificant difference?
So, I mean, the thing about this particular trial, like many Alzheimer's trials, is that they tried to do many different points of evaluation. So they did ADAS-Cog, they did ADCS-ADL, they did CDR-SB, they did CGI-I. So they do a lot of different analyses, and the thing is though, this particular study, well, in all studies, you always have to predefine like what you're going to be looking at. You have to pre-specify your endpoints. And so they decided to choose ADAS-Cog and ADCS-ADL, and then like afterwards, when they realized that they failed on the second endpoint, they decided to try to change it, and they're like, well, CDR-SB is just as good, and actually we meant to use this one instead. And so the difference is actually statistically significant for CDRSB. It's a smaller scale than ADAS-Cog. ADAS-Cog is a bit of a bigger like scale, like a more dynamic range to it than CDRSB. But those two tests were stat sig. But again, critically, like they just threw out a bunch of patients. Like they didn't define like what ITT meant. Like they didn't define like why they removed 40 patients out of the analysis cohort. And so that's really what it comes down to, is that they didn't ever show any like meaningful difference between placebo and drug arm if you consider like the whole entirety of the patient population. Like we said, like we know the EMA is going to ask that question. In fact, we know that they've asked that question because like when you submit your package to the EMA, they come back to you and ask you questions. Like they have like a list of questions. That's literally what it is. It's a list of questions that they send to you, and then you have a chance to respond, and then you can respond, and then they can come back to you and say there's still a list of outstanding issues, and this is what they sent to them in September. And now, this week, what happened is the EMA actually graced them with the opportunity, because I don't think that they even should have, but should have thrown this one in the out back. But they graced them with a chance to give an oral explanation. Explain yourself orally before us, and to explain why you've thrown out all of these patients, why you've done this kind of analysis. And that oral explanation happened on Tuesday, and I can't imagine it went well, because at the end of the day, like, how could it?
But
And
but would you say that from all of these scores, there was a score that was more significant towards drug approval?
I mean, yeah, like, well, if you look at the analysis that they present, like, they present an analysis, and two of those tests hit stat sig, and they say that this is enough to gain approval. On its face, like, that's a reasonable argument, but the problem again is that you have removed so many patients that it's a worthless result. It's completely spurious. If you take into consideration the entire patient cohort that was actually given the drug, which the EMA will, because that's in their guidelines, and that's explicitly what any reasonable clinical trial evaluator would do. If you do that, then the difference shrinks, and there is no difference between placebo and drug, and therefore, this is basically a horrible drug, and it won't get approved.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense.
Yeah.
All right, guys.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you
I
very
was just
much.
going to add that, like, multiple comparisons is kind of one of the other devils of statistical analysis. That if you try to compare many different tests, you may eventually get one by accident. And while I don't think that's exactly what happened here, it's just something to watch out for. I do think the main, kind of red flag or bombshell here is the ITT redefinition, the throwing out of patients not at random. I think they threw out patients who biased the study, and the tipping point analysis tells us that. But always looking out for pre-specified endpoints without doing multiple comparisons. There are ways to adjust multiple comparisons. I gave a talk at Harvard about this, and it was, it was actually sponsored by a statistics professor, which I didn't know going into it. So he was very happy when I showed the error correction methods that you can use. And it's just sort of one of these things that, again, does not make sense to human psychology. It is one of the hardest sort of things to understand intuitively. Once you spend enough time on it, you get it and you accept it. But there's sort of this part of you that always says, well, no, the cancer drug works. It's just that you have to look at it this way. And, the ones that have done this for so long will smile and say, okay, you have to learn your lesson the hard way. And this is going to be yet again one of those times. What sucks is that people will stop investing in biotech after they do this, because they just throw up their hands and say, oh, it was too hard. But they were just as sure of themselves going into it, then they're just as sure that they can't get there afterwards. And it's just, it sucks to see the same thing over and over and over and over again. Swisher, maybe?
How likely is it possible that they threw out like patients that were non-responders? Just
Yeah. Pretty likely.
Yeah, it's hard to say what happened here, and that's why the CSR is the gold standard. When you pay a CRO, an outside third-party company, to do a clinical trial, they come back to you with a CSR. The CSR is what the SEC and FBI are going to be getting in a situation like this, and they're going to look at the CSR and say, well, according to the CRO, who doesn't want to go to jail, the CRO said that this was your p-value. And you all of a sudden did, these changes to redefine everything so that you thought this was your p-value, because you knew that if you did the real p-value, you wouldn't have gotten anywhere. Your stock would have gone down, and instead you were able to pay yourself salary, stock, and all these things. And I think that the CSR is really what you're paying for. It's the final report of the clinical trial that you commissioned, and it's usually 100, 150 pages, and you really can't redefine or fuck with it. And again, I would love to see a redacted CSR here or from other companies in the industry, but I don't think we're ever going to get there. Sometimes the only visibility we get, as we saw with Capper, was the FDA telling you that actually, no, you didn't do it the right way.
They're pretty clear.
Nikki.
Yeah, Noam, did you want to jump in, or somebody else?
Yeah. If I can jump in, that would be great. I just had a quick question about how you're actually doing the trade. I'm assuming you're not really using any options. You're just naked shorting it, just because the option premiums are so expensive. But what would you say the potential downside is it sounds like it's almost impossible that the drug would actually succeed. But if it does, what would be the potential downside, and how high could the stock possibly go?
Yeah, two good questions. The first is that I do options on binary events. I try not to trade options in general, but with binary events, you have pretty good reasons to do them. So I think the Novembers are in play. The Decembers are like 99% chance it's in play. But it's one of these things where caveat emptor. You're on your own. Don't blame me if something goes wrong. I'm just telling you, I think the stock's going to cash value. Cash value here is probably around $1. They have been burning money, as all product-less biotech companies do. They've been burning cash, and so when we get their latest cash figures, we should see 75 cents a share ish of cash, in my estimation. And that's usually where companies that have given up all hope and are doing strategic alternatives will go. Some companies will sometimes try to play the game that, oh no, actually, we're fine. This is nothing. Nothing's wrong. We'll be fine. The market's going to see through that pretty clearly. But I do think, they're going to try to get re-examined. They're going to try to, if they can kick this can down the road to next year, they will. But the reality is, I do think the jig is up. Now, if they somehow did get a EMA approval, well, I certainly think that the doctors won't pay for it, or the countries won't pay for it, and the doctors won't prescribe it. But it obviously would be good news, and I could see the stock double on that, maybe go to 12. Anything to add or subtract, Anthony?
I mean, yeah, there's certainly, in any binary on a biotech, going to be, risk of getting it wrong. But that's why we do what we do. We bet pretty consistently on absolute 100% sure things, and I it would take something absolutely miraculous, truly, like Jesus himself is back on earth, before I see Anavex get approved from the EMA. So.
Yeah, and I second that.
Okay, interesting. That's super interesting. I appreciate the explanation. So I'm assuming you're just naked shorting it just because the options premiums are so expensive. You're effectively paying
Oh,
half
it
the.
sounds like that's your opinion. I am long all the puts in November and December,
Oh, you are. Okay, so
and
how would.
I'm short the stock.
Okay, interesting. So what would be the calculation on the long the puts? Because if I go based off of memory, for the puts it's what, $2.50 per $5 put. So at that point, what you make, if it gets to your $1.25 estimation per share, you're not really making that big of a percentage compared to the money that you're fronting, really, are you? Like, what am I missing there?
I don't think you're missing anything. I think that the 5 puts would go to $4 a put. Yesterday they were more like $2. So $2 to $4 is a good return in my book.
Okay, interesting. Makes sense. I really appreciate the explanation.
For sure. All right, let's go to anybody else. Who else wants to jump in?
Okay, if no one else is jumping in the moment, I might just add one tiny question, which is, how do you actually weigh up in terms of the calculation, how you split it up between shorts and puts? Is it basically just to sort of spread the risk?
Hey, can someone hear me?
We can hear you. There was another question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was given the be
No,
okay.
just 2 seconds. Yeah, I don't have a lot to add there. I mean, I think the experience guides you a little bit. You want to do a simulation of every stock price outcome and ask yourself, are you happy with the P&L at every possibility from 1 to 100? And if the answer is yes, that's the trade you want. If the answer is no, change the trade until you have the payout graph that you want. All right, let's go, Apo.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your time and the opportunity. I'm not gonna go deep into the company because I don't have the same amount of knowledge as you guys, obviously. I just want to ask Martin, what's the level of confidence if we compare the trade to Cassava, Immune, and Atir?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we try to only do. I mean, if you're going to put your neck out in public and risk being wrong, that's something we don't want to do lightly, and especially with this super high conviction prediction that a bad thing will happen to a drug company that's going to send its stock down a lot. This is not just a trade, right? This is something we do a few times a year. This year, I think we've done 2, so this would be the third for this year, and that's quite frankly above average. In my career, there's sometimes, generally on average about two a year that I do. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's zero. So this is a little above average with three, but I think that, you know, you don't want to be gambling in biotech. And with the FDA, as we've seen recently, like with Unicure, with Replimune, like you never know. Shit happens all the time. It comes and goes. There's no real rhyme or reason sometimes to, oh, I thought that trial would work, it didn't work. I thought that trial wouldn't work, it did work. We try to stick to that level of conviction. So I can't really tease apart like, is this worse or better than this or that? Because they're all sort of the same. They're all a little bit of a different movie in the same genre, but they're all sort of the same movie in some ways. I don't know if you want to add anything, Anthony.
Yeah, I mean, we're quite sure. That's what I would say. I mean, we know that. I mean, at the end of the day, like if you just read the evidence that they've put out, it is definitely low quality evidence, like low level of certainty that this drug works, is what anyone would have to say when they look at it. And we know that because like you know, there are whenever anyone writes anything in this field, right? You decide how much burden you want to take on, right? Like you can sit there and you can take on a lot of burden, and you can have a very well run trial that answers a lot of questions very faithfully, or you can run a low burden trial, and you can put out results that are quite easily challenged by even basic questions like like the first one was like intention to treat or not. And like if you can't answer those kinds of very very basic questions convincingly, like with your paper and with your data, like you've just, it's almost assured that like you failed. And because like why would you, like why would you take a low burden uh data like presentation, like why would you show a low burden result when you could have a high burden result and like definitely get approval and definitely convince everyone, and like definitely, because like this isn't just about the inexperienced person like looking at their data. It's about like doctors, like professional regulators, like true professionals in this field, like are going to ask like really hard questions, like really intense questions. And so if you can't answer those, like you just have no shot. And they can't. And that's kind of where it is. Like I look at the data that they've shown. I've shown how they play their hands. Like they show great weakness, as my grandfather would say. So
And just a small follow up, if I have the opportunity. Can you explain a little bit briefly why they didn't go to the FDA for the drug? Is it because they don't trust it, or do they have a problem with the FDA? Just briefly, if you have the time. Thank you.
yeah, I mean, yeah, I wouldn't put words in their mouth, but I would just say that it. I mean, a couple of things. Like one, they didn't like their entire clinical trial was run outside of the United States, so they never intended to go to the FDA, in my opinion. But two, like uh, the FDA, I think the process is done and over quite quickly. I think with the EMA, they can kind of kick the can down the road a lot more, but I really can't tell you exactly why they
Yeah,
made the
I
decision.
can add to this. I mean, as somebody who's run publicly traded drug companies and privately traded ones, if you have a good drug, you whatever the circumstance may be, we see this sometimes with Chinese trials, you go and do an FDA, US clinical trial for FDA approval. All the money's here, right? Like you can sell $5 billion of a good Alzheimer's drug. So if you thought your drug worked, independent of whether you can, you go on mute real quick?
Sure.
Pushpa, your noise is in our ears. Okay, goodbye. Um, so if you had the confidence that a drug worked, like you said, oh, I love my asset. I know this drug works. The first thing you would do is go do a clinical trial. Now, trials aren't cheap, but this company could raise 100 million. They could go ahead and tell the world, we're going to do this for the FDA because you should be excited. This is going to be a blockbuster, and it probably would make their stock go up, to be frank. But they didn't even have the confidence to do that. I mean, if you're the CEO of this company, why wouldn't go do that phase three? You're basically telling the world, I don't believe in my drug that much because this $100 million phase three is, I have other things to spend money on. It's like, well, what? Do the trial. And I think that, it speaks volumes. Without doing there are trials that, have that situation where they did not include a U.S. site for whatever reason. Again, this happens in China every day. Summit has this situation, and they're doing 10, new phase 3s in the U.S. because they believe the drug works. Now, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but if you don't believe as a CEO that your drug works, what are you doing? Why are you filing in Europe? Does it work in Europe and not in the US? Is there something special about French DNA that this drug will only work for Alzheimer's disease patients in Europe? I mean, it makes no sense. So I think that speaks volumes. And then, yeah, I mean, the question does beget another question: is there some regulatory barrier where the FDA told you something that maybe you're not sharing with everybody as to why you couldn't do this trial in the U.S.? I think that is sort of there as well. And then finally, what I was going to say is that I think part of what explains this whole story is the company wanted to pivot to another drug, a drug for schizophrenia that's similar to the Alzheimer's drug. And that drug, they recently had results for. And I think the goal was to soften the blow of this drug by replacing it with that drug. The problem is that drug didn't work either. And the market did not like that drug's data. And it was just very bad data. So they sort of have two strikeouts here. I think that was sort of the game plan. Any other questions?
I had a question if I could.
Yeah.
So, looking ahead to tomorrow, where would this data drop? Like on a public release, or is there a
Yeah.
place that I could go to like watch
Sure.
this?
It's the EMA, European Medicines Agency, CHMP. C like Charlie, H like Harry, medicines, and P like Peter. CHMP for the EMA. And this is just a standard thing in biopharma. They have a website. They'll drop the minutes. What do you think, Anthony? 5 a.m., 3 a.m., something like that?
I think it'll come out a bit closer to like 7 to like 10 or so. Like we just don't know when exactly, but like by end of day, um, in Europe, yeah. So like by 10 a.m. we should have it.
And it's up to the company to sort of put out a press release on their side, which
Yeah,
usually
like if the company wants to PR, they got to do that on their side. They will know like how this decision is trending, as of today. Like they probably already know, to be honest, because the CHMP votes on how they feel, like how they want to vote, um, positive or negative, or kind of like punt them into December. They have that vote on Thursday, so that's done, and then they can inform the company how that's, like I said, trending, and then that lets the company know, well, you can withdraw if you want, and some have, like, in fact, it's like a common, not common, but like it's fairly often the case that like companies will just like straight up like pull their um their application from the EMA. But in this case, we're not hearing anything yet, and so we'll hear something hopefully tomorrow from the EMA, and that should happen by the end of day in Europe, and this should be early in the morning for us. So
I would also say that in absence of a comment in the minutes for the comp is actually bearish. That's usually followed by rejection. So, we will see how it goes. But, if it's not tomorrow, it's December 12th. And they can't run away from this forever. It's their only drug. It's not like they have some other thing that you could value. It's the company's burning money on salaries and research and whatever. And those, that money is continuously being subtracted from their cash balance. And most of the times in situations like this, companies are valued at their cash balance or less. So I think that, this is sort of going to be their fate. We've seen this movie so many times. Again, never say never. The shareholders of this company are largely, from what we can tell, fairly uninformed retail investors. They're not really professionals. Every professional that we've talked to says that the same thing we're saying. They're just not willing to say it out loud. And that's sort of the disposition for most. Any final questions? I'm just gonna add a few people because I think we were running in circles here at some point.
Hey, Martin, how are you?
Good.
I had a question. In the past, you've made a comment that Alzheimer's is not a disease you treat after a certain point. You want to use preventative therapy. You think that there's a point of no return for many patients. The drug in question with Anavex is a autophagy accelerator, and I wonder what would be like a comp like flavonoids like fisetin do similar things. I'd love to see a comparable study on that. But I do believe that in autoimmune disease and neuroinflammation, the sigma receptor 1, the dopamine transport molecule, and histamine H3, which is only found in the brain, there is some connection there. What would you think is a better, a company that's currently working on trying to reverse Alzheimer's, if that's even possible? Like, what's a better comparable? Like, where would you put your money otherwise?
Yeah, I don't know that I'd put my money anywhere otherwise, but I think that, if you know this disease, beta amyloid is the causative factor. I think that's indisputable from genetic data. And then if you look at, the other sort of molecules that are in play here, ApoE is the other genetic factor that's indisputable, where if you have the right or wrong allele of ApoE, you have a pretty dramatic under or overexposure to Alzheimer's. So I like the companies trying to work on ApoE. I mostly like big pharma. I don't think there are too many small companies that are doing great work on Alzheimer's. Denali has a beta shuttle antibody that's
Do you like Voyager's monoclonal that's removing the beta amyloid?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the industry has tried a million ways to remove beta amyloid, and it's not been that great, needless to say. And part of that could be the way you remove it, the species, the timing. We don't really know. I do think that it'd be great if we did Alzheimer's trials that lasted 20 years, but the cost prohibitive, nature of that is something that's, should be something that we can address, whether it's through government, industry sponsorship, or even just lengthening patents for Alzheimer's. This government makes the rules. We can pass a law very easily that says any Alzheimer's patent gets 40 years of protection, because instead of 17 or 20, because it's going to take 20 years to tell if the drug works or not. It's a long-term disease. So I think we should do long-term studies. The idea that you can do a 1-year, 2-year Alzheimer's study and see a difference is wishful thinking. I mean, if you know neural networks, the brain sort of works a little bit like neural networks. And if you do pruning in neural networks, there is a point of no return. If you prune one weight or bias from a neural network, it works exactly the same. You could do that with GPT-5, and GPT-5 you could not tell the difference. But as you prune 5%, you still probably couldn't tell the difference. But once you lose 10% of the neurons, 20, 30, 40, eventually you have Alzheimer's. And whether it's a synthetic neural network or biological one. And I think that the dream of repairing that after they've been removed is pretty unlikely. You want to repair them before they get removed, or stop them from being removed. And I think that synaptoprotection, is kind of a very vague idea. It could be an autoimmune thing. It could be synaptic integrity molecules, of which there are 1,000 different proteins that maintain synapses. So we don't know how to do that. And I think it's just one of these things where Fermat's theorem was stated in the 1600s, and it took 400 years of mathematics to build the edifice upon which Andrew Wiles could climb to prove Fermat's theorem. Nobody could prove Fermat's theorem without those little other helpers and insights that the other mathematicians made. And the same thing applies here, where one-shotting Alzheimer's is not going to work until we understand the brain better. One-shotting Alzheimer's is not going to work until we understand beta amyloid and ApoE better. And these things might take 100 years, 200 years. I mean, I don't see why we expect that we can one-shot this. I think we do pattern recognition from other diseases and say, well, in oncology, you can stop one aberrant protein and really save somebody's life. That's great, for EGFR. But Alzheimer's isn't that. And we're still unraveling this disease, and there's even more mysterious diseases, because at the end of the day, what is cognition? It's this meta effect that arises from this physical substrate, the brain, and it's really hard to tell how that arises. It's puzzled people for millennia. And so adjusting things in the brain that will hopefully improve the meta effect is this is like rocket science. I mean, it's much harder than rocket science. There's no way to do it.
Can I ask you, if you do mitophagy or autophagy in the brain, but the lymphatic function is disabled or inhibited, does that defeat the purpose? And are those toxins free floating where they don't drain out and possibly cause more neuroinflammation and autoimmune activity?
That's one hypothesis, but I think it's probably as good as you and me in 200 BC pointing at the sun and saying, "What do you think? How do you think that thing works?"
Yeah,
and it's kind of.
I filed a patent on that idea. So for long COVID patients, but
yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of literature and analysis on that, as you know, and it's certainly a promising area of research, but we don't know if is this the last mile before the research, or are we looking at the sun and saying, I think it's fusion.
Yeah.
I think that, we don't have the words to describe what's happening in the brain of Alzheimer's patients. Now, again, we may be closer to your answer, we may be closer to my answer. I don't know. It could all be lymphatic drainage. I would bet not, but it could be. I would not put $1 million in that. I don't know. I'm going to wait and see. But I do know that this isn't it from Anavex.
I
Let's go
I
on to the
appreciate
next.
you, Martin. I'll step back. Thank you.
No, thank you.
I just want to add and say that I think I'm pretty excited to see how Lilly's trial turns out as well. They're running a really long trial. I think Lilly and Biogen both started really long-term clinical trials in Alzheimer's about 5, 6, 7 years ago or something, and we hope to see actually a 5-year top-line readout in the near future. Near being
Is
like
that Trailblazer
I,
3 or
I
4
think
or
I think
5?
that's right. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't looked at it in a while, but I just I keep it in the background of my mind because I know their whole premise was treating patients who were pre-Alzheimer's, but they had like the I think ApoE4 gene, right? So it's like very likely that they would uh, become full-blown Alzheimer's, and so early intervention may actually have something.
Yeah, I mean, every disease, early intervention's best, and I think that, Lilly, of all the companies, has made this profound, deep, long-term investment in Alzheimer's, and if anybody's going to crack it, I'd probably bet on Lilly, but I also know the limitations of big pharma and their ability to be innovative, but I do bet on Lilly. John?
Hi. Hi, Martin. I was wondering, this is kind of an off-the-wall question. I was wondering if you think there's any possibility that, central banks and financial interests are preparing for a major deflationary period.
What does this have to do with Anavex?
It doesn't.
Oh, yeah,
It's total. It's total.
we're
Okay.
only here to talk about Anavex. David?
Yeah, thanks, guys. Can you hear me okay? Can I just check?
Yes?
Perfect. Yeah, I've been short for about a month and I have been following the company, and it seems like they have been putting out a lot on the precision medicine approach, going for that Sigma-1 wild type gene subgroup. So I'm wondering what they would actually need to do to get approval, well, conditional approval for a genetic subgroup. Would they have to do a stratified clinical study where they are explicitly
Right.
looking at that, or what is the sort of process for that?
I mean, subgroups are post hoc observations that are hypothesis generating only, right? So, like, at the end of the day, you can't say, I'm going to win this marathon. I'll bet you $100 I'm going to win this marathon. And you don't finish the marathon. And then when your friend says, all right, bud, pay up, you said, what do you mean? You pay up. I did the first mile. He said, that's not what we bet on. You said, I don't care. That's what we bet on now. And you say, what the hell? And that, as nonsensical as that is, that's exactly what a post hoc observation is. You can't change it after the fact and say, oh, well, actually, it's the Sigmar patients that did really well. The best you can do is say, I think it might be the Sigmar patients. I have to go do a new trial that proves that. And I bet you that's probably what they're going to try to do if they want to keep this ruse going on. But the beautiful thing about post hoc observations is that you can take an infinite number of them. And if you don't correct the p-value for those observations, you're committing statistical fraud. And I feel like, this should be obvious to anybody. It's, again, bet on the Knicks game. And when the Bulls beat the Knicks, you say, no, 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 I actually won the game because they had more rebounds than the Bulls. Your friend would look at you as if you lost your mind. And if you tried that with your bookie, they'd probably beat you up. So I think that, this kind of thing is just so, lost in the sauce of just, how you don't do things in biotech, that it makes, like Anthony was saying, it makes everyone look bad, and it's shameful. So I feel like, you just can't do that until you've actually met a prospective primary endpoint. Generate hypothesis all you want, but I don't think this is, even possible. Like, EMA would laugh them out of the room, I think, if they tried to suggest that that's, the best way to handle this.
Yeah, for sure. I would just say that you can certainly you can run this kind of a trial. Like precision medicine is a growing field. I mean, it's not like it's interesting, right? Like you have to obviously pre-specify an endpoint, like we say. You have to go after a specific biological marker, have biological rationale for it, and ultimately hit on that premise. And you kind of pigeonhole yourself, but you could look at something like KRAS. Is a really nice place where we're really starting to see some really wonderful precision medicine type therapies coming online, right? In PDAC and in those really, I mean, historically, awful places for to be a patient and to be in drug development. Honestly, this pancreatic cancer space, which is now seeing a huge rise in drug development because they're making good drugs. Like it's great. Like I just went to ESMO a little while ago, a couple month or two ago, and some of the advancement in that space from international collaborators is really awesome. Like you look at revolutions medicine, the precision medicine stuff is like really starting to get hot. And so I think there's a place for it, but I don't think that like what Anavex has done here is like even is really worth talking about. But I think that precision medicine is like a an interesting space, and I look forward to seeing more of it. I think we just had an approval today. I think it was AML. There's like a subgroup, like a genetic subgroup that just got approval today as well. So yeah, it's coming online.
Perfect. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Anybody else want to pop up a question? We'll try to get to as many people as we can. Louis, you've been dying to ask a question. What's up?
Hi, Martin. I guess my question is kind of going back to the test vessels. Is this pretty common where they kind of start erasing data or start erasing test subjects?
Well, I think we spent a lot of time on this in this call. I mean, at the end of the day, all data has to be preserved. I think that what the company would say is that they are providing the correct way to look at the data, and that there is some reason, some excuse as to why one should not look at the data this way or that way. And that, that's kind of the, perspective the company has. The problem is that that perspective is very self-serving, and that if you were going to take a perspective like that, you have to specify it before the fact instead of after the fact. And there's also a standard way to do this. You're not supposed to throw out patients because it would make your drug look better. If anything, maybe you could throw out patients, for a really legitimate reason, and you would have to define that before the fact, because it runs the risk of you basically deciding after the fact what would make your drug look the best, which obviously, you can make any change you want to sort of do that. The dropouts are, kind of something that I think they knew were going to happen going ahead of this. And it's, again, such an obvious bias that you would want to control for it. They did try to control for it. The control shows that you can't control for it without removing the efficacy of the drug. So I don't think it's normal to remove patients. If you try to remove patients from the database or alter data, that is fraud. That has almost never happened in the history of biopharma, so far as we know. One of the reasons for that is there's an independent clinical research organization that runs these trials, the CRO. It's very rare or impossible even for data to be manipulated. And I think if you see the data here, the data show no separation until the final part of the trial, the final measurement of 48 weeks. They start separating at, say, 36 weeks. That sort of shows you that these data were not manipulated, because if that's fairly bad to begin with. Perhaps there could be some last minute manipulation, but no, manipulating data is extremely rare in terms of direct data substitution, like editing a cell of the data in a database or an Excel file or something. It's more likely that, again, the company redefined the way they should handle the data, and they present it in a way that is very non-standard, that would fool anybody but somebody who's been doing this for many years.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then I guess my second question was, I follow your podcast a lot, and I hear that, we're almost coming to an end with pharma, because I guess every major disease basically has a cure. So do you only follow example like Alzheimer's?
Yeah, it's a good question. This is about my hypothesis that increasingly over time, the treatments that we need for human society have been found, and we're necessarily, by definition, going to run out of things to work on. When I was starting in the industry, cystic fibrosis was a huge unmet need. Today, you would be out of your mind to try to make a cystic drug because, well, Vertex made them all. There's still diseases, we still suffer, so that's not going away tomorrow, but I think it will go away over, say, 50 or 100 years. And there's plenty of investments for us to make between now and then Duchenne muscular dystrophy comes to mind amongst many, many other diseases, including oncology, where oncology has come a long way, but it's still, cancer is a death sentence for many, many cancer tumor types. And autoimmune disease has also come an extremely long way. When I started in industry, TNFs were first coming out as the first smart autoimmune drugs, and now we have dozens of them. So I think, we've come a long way, but, there's still huge amounts of unmet medical need: Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, many rare diseases like Huntington's. So there's room for improvement, but, GLPs also advanced the ball quite a bit, I think. So mental health is still like, that's kind of the 100-year probably outcome where, we can finally get great drugs for depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, anxiety. I suffer from anxiety, so a non-benzodiazepine for anxiety would be great. And other, diseases that are harder to treat, like again, a lot of these have to deal with the brain, where we just don't know very much. It's hard to mess with a living brain, for example, where you can maybe do that with the rest of the body. All right. Any last questions?
I had a one last follow up.
Go ahead.
All right, so you project the dollar for tomorrow. What was your overall basis on that projection, and what do you see that could cause it to go even lower?
Yeah, I mean, the company has very little cash. So if you were a value investor, if you were Warren Buffett, and your job was to say, well, what would I pay for this company? If the European Union's medical agency says we're not going to approve this drug, then at the end of the day, why would you pay anything for the drug? You would just pay the value of the company's assets, which is just cash. So that's the value of the company's assets, about $1. Tomorrow, the European agency is going to tell us whether or not they're going to approve it. At least I think. If I'm wrong about that, which I accept, like I said, there's a 25% chance I'm wrong with that, we're just going to hear on December 12th, and we're going to hear the same thing either way. Obviously, if they approve it or something, I'd be dead wrong and really, look like a fool, because I'm really making a big statement here that we're sure this is going to happen. It's not like a good trade or like I think this will happen. Like, we are 100% sure, and we do this kind of thing where we put out a paper and we write it up and we give our thoughts and do a call. Like, we do this a few times a year for the last few years, and so far we haven't been wrong. And in this case, I think that's what's going to happen. We'll see what happens, if it's tomorrow or the 12th of December. But either way, we feel like there's no chance the European Medical Agency will approve this drug. Last question, anybody? All right.
Yeah, hi. Hello. I've just got one question here. It's just on the EMA versus FDA that you mentioned. So it's a bit of a consulting question, to be fair. Could it be a case where with the European continent versus the US, let's just say, you're talking a population count of around 450 million versus, say, 330 odd million,
Yeah.
with a median age of 45 in Europe and around 38, I think, in the United States. So would that just be a total addressable market sort of case for the company in terms of the EMA choice over the FDA? Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Most of the pharma drugs sell way more in the United States versus Europe, including in Alzheimer's. In fact, for Alzheimer's, the payers are very sensitive about paying for a drug that's not giving them benefit. And that's why some of the latest Alzheimer's drugs have flopped in the US and in Europe. So it's actually kind of become a tough place to sell medicine. Europe is a viciously tough place to sell medicine. They will only pay for medicine that really moves the needle, and this isn't it, nor is unfortunately, any other Alzheimer's drug. So I don't think it's that. I think that, a true wonder drug would sell well everywhere, but I feel like, again, with Europe's medical approach to medicines, which I'm glad President Trump has recently criticized, they really expect to get this really great price on everything, which, they are fully entitled to advocate for. But, we pay a much higher price in America. And one of two things has to happen. Our price has to go down here, the price has to go up there. And I think that, every politician's plan for the longest time was to lower prices here, but there's now finally some attention being paid to, well, what about raising the prices over there? and we're seeing more and more drug companies decide to do that. Nevertheless, again, there's just a difference in how to practice medicine out of there. There's sort of just a much more strict kind of like evidence of success, where Americans are like a little more willing to try things. I think in Europe there's kind of, for example, a lot of psychiatric conditions are treated much less treated in Europe, and new psychiatric drugs just don't sell well over there. Physicians prefer to use generics, for example. So, I don't think it's that. I think it's just kind of a crappy company just doing a terrible job. And, they did a trial in Europe because doing trials is a lot easier outside of the US. The US is a bit of a rigorous trial system, but once you have done the trials, they're a little more lenient on approval. Europe and the rest of the world is the opposite. In some cases, you actually don't need to do anything special to register a clinical trial. In Australia, for example, and New Zealand, they're extremely benevolent about doing a clinical trial there. In the US, you have to jump through a lot of hoops. So I think the company just never jumped through those hoops here. And again, this is a weird story, but it should be coming to an end soon. All right, everyone, thank you so much for listening. We'll see what happens tomorrow, or the 12th. But we're really, really convinced here. This is my best idea for the portfolio right now, and we'll see how it turns out. Part 2 coming soon. Thanks a lot, Anthony.
GG's. Thanks for the time. Bye bye.